When you go to a school library, it isn't hard to guess what you'll find most of the students doing there. Reading. A library is a place for reading. We've brought you to this library to introduce you to a very good reader, Dick. Dick is also a good student, partly because of his good reading habits. There are many reasons why he is a good reader, but one of them is probably more important than any other. To show you the key to Dick's effective reading, we're going to use this balloon over his head. In the balloon, you'll see why Dick is reading, to find out who were the Aztecs. Dick is reading with a purpose. A purpose is often a question you ask yourself when you read. Dick reads many different things in many different ways, but he always reads with a purpose. For example, one time he might read a sports story in the newspaper in this way, quite rapidly. He might have one purpose such as this in mind, to find out who were the stars. Another time, Dick might read a science book in this way, slowly and carefully. Now, his purpose might be to try to understand how plants manufacture food. Perhaps you've noticed that each time we mentioned Dick's purpose for reading, we also called your attention to the material he was reading and to how he was reading. In what way do these three ideas go together? What is the relationship between your purpose for reading, the material you read, and how you read? To see, let's take a book that is easy to read. Suppose your purpose for reading it is fun. How would you read it? Probably rather fast, wouldn't you? But suppose you have a book that is hard to read. If your purpose for reading this book is to study it, then your reading should be slow and careful, shouldn't it? Now, perhaps you can see how these ideas go together. Let's put it this way. Your purpose for reading plus the material you read equals how you read. It's a simple formula, isn't it? But the key to it, remember, is purpose. Perhaps you're like Dick, skillful at discovering purposes and using them. Or perhaps you're like Fred, who doesn't seem to know his purposes for reading or how to find them. Just look at his balloon, empty. It's empty because Fred usually reads without having a purpose clearly in mind. He just reads. What do you suppose this does to Fred's reading? Well, he usually reads without getting much pleasure or understanding from his reading. But Fred would like to be a better reader, and he is trying to learn to find purposes for reading. By watching Fred, you'll see how you can learn to discover your purposes for reading. At home, Fred has some reading to do. He knows that having a purpose will help him read better. But what is his purpose? Why is he reading this book? Well, because his teacher, Mrs. Green, told him to. But is this really the purpose? What about this question that Mrs. Green also wrote on the board? How did communications help our country grow? This is what Mrs. Green really asked the class to find out. Fred finds that he can answer Mrs. Green's question better if he keeps it in mind as he reads. Now, do you see what's happened? Fred has discovered a purpose for his reading. And what material is he reading? A textbook with much information that has to be understood for such a purpose. So how should he read it? Perhaps in more than one way. Fred has learned that in reading to study a textbook, It helps to look over the material rapidly first, reading mainly the titles of the different sections. This gives him a general view of what the key ideas are, how they follow each other, and how they fit together. So while reading rapidly, or while reading slowly, Fred tries to keep in mind his purpose. Good teachers like Mrs. Green often give you purposes for reading. You're also given a purpose for reading when you're told to find some very specific information in a reference book. Suppose your purpose is to find out what is the area of Central America. What is your material? An encyclopedia, a book with a great deal of information, much more information than you need if you just want to find a single fact. So how should you read? You should skim rapidly, of course. In this case, you don't have to read every word carefully to find the one fact you want. In other cases, the material helps determine your specific purpose, as in following instructions in a recipe for making fudge. The recipe carries with it a purpose for reading. So if your purpose is to find out how do you make fudge, you'll study each step carefully. It's easy to know your purpose when you're following instructions. But suppose you're reading something else. Suppose you're reading a newspaper. Did you know that in newspapers, specific purposes for reading are often suggested by the headlines? Here's a news item. In reading the headline, "Venus Rocket Launched," what questions might you ask? Perhaps you want to find out who launched it, or what does it carry? These questions could be your purpose for reading the whole article. You get the same kind of help in finding purposes in your school books, as Fred is discovering now. Although he's keeping his main purpose in mind, he's finding that in his book, the section titles are also useful in suggesting other purposes to help him get more from his reading. Take this one, for example. 2 uses for signals. If Fred thinks, what are the 2 uses, as he reads about signals in communication, he'll be more likely to find the answer and remember it. So Fred is learning how to use the idea of purpose in his reading and how to find purposes which may be given to him or suggested to him by what he is reading. He knows your purpose for reading plus the material you read equals how you read. But what about this kind of book, a story? Fred will begin reading it later. How will he find his purpose for reading a story? We'll see. Now Fred is going to begin reading Robinson Crusoe. Does he have a purpose? He'll have to discover one for himself. He knows he should have a purpose, but his balloon is empty. He can find a purpose if he just asks himself, why am I reading this? There's a purpose, enjoyment. His general purpose is enjoyment. His material is a story not too hard to read. So how should he read it? Fairly fast. And as he goes along, he tries to think of other purposes to help him enjoy the story more, such as, what will happen next? Whose footprint is it? Will Robinson Crusoe be rescued? And so Fred is beginning to take the most important step of all in reading, learning to discover his own purposes. We'll leave Fred well on his way to becoming a better reader. But what about you? Is your balloon filled when you read? Remember, your purpose for reading plus the material you read equals how you read. Good reading means asking yourself questions to help discover your purposes for reading. Having a purpose when you read is the key to effective reading.